but I think we will be stimulated and kept awake quite well by the next item on the agenda, which is the presentation by Al-Wahat. So Al-Wahat is an artist research collective committed to growing communal practices in ecologies typically regarded as hostile and lifeless. They were formed in 2022, so not a very old collective, but quite firmly formed, at the Center for Research Architecture by Ailo Ribas, Areej, Ashhab, and Gabriella Demczuk. And two of them, Ailo and Gabriella, are here today. Areej was going to join us. She was very brave and persistent in seeking to leave out of Tel Aviv until last week, but unfortunately couldn't be with us. But Gabriella and Ailo are here and will represent her perspective, and I think she is also following by the live stream. Al-Wahat seeks to counter harmful anthropocentric and colonial narratives around arid lands that position them as empty, unproductive, or waste. So there's a clear connection here to the conversations that we started this morning. And to do this, they engage with a diversity of knowledges, be they local, scientific, more than human, that take into account the material and ecological and social implications of climate change. So Al-Wahat have been artists in residence at Sakia, one of the Palestinian organizations within the Soil Futures project, and will also be telling us about that as part of their presentation. And they are the Cole Prize winners for Art and Ecology in 2023. So they're going to Paris in a few weeks to collect that prize. Congratulations. And they are the 2023 LINA Fellows for their project Wild Hedges, which is about some interesting cacti ecologies. And they are passing around, I think, already some samples for you to engage with. So Ailo and Gabriella, welcome. Warm welcome, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm Gabriella, this is Ailo, and Areej is with us online right now. And so we are at Wahat. You want to go to the next slide? No, before. Yeah. So we started at Goldsmiths, University of London, where the three of us were doing our research. We were each looking at different themes, different ideas. Ailo looking at the themes of invasiveness, weediness within her work, looking at a nature reserve in London. Areej was looking more at the weaponization of nature and counter-archiving in Palestine as it relates to trees. And then myself, I was looking more at biological patenting and colonial land practices, how the different modes of abstraction, proprietary modes of abstraction. And so all of these themes started to coalesce into this one plant, which became an entry point for us to then start to explore. And so that was the prickly pear cactus. And so we formed this collective, Al-Wahat, which in Arabic is a fertile area within a dry, arid environment. And so through that idea, we're trying to sort of counter these ideas of aridity, of desert, and trying to understand sort of the environment as more than. You can go next. And so in this image here, taken in 1911, You see this man who is overlooking the farmland with acres and acres of prickly pear cactus hedge. And so this image was taken in Gaza, and it was before the state of Israel, where Arabs and people in the region had freedom of movement to go in between. And really the only borders that you had were these hedges. And I find it interesting that we are here in Oslo right now, because as we're talking about this idea of soil futures in Palestine, we also have to take note of soil history and how with the Oslo Accords that were drafted here, it really started to, back then it was seen as this peace treaty, but actually what has happened is that it has actually divided the land more and more and has separated Palestinians from their soil, from their land. And so what we are seeing today is a direct result of that, as well as 75 years of ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people.
We started the research in London, where we used to be based, the three of us, by going through the archives at Kew Gardens, which is one of the largest colonial plant archives in Europe. So for a bit of context, the prickly pear cactus arrived to Europe via the Spanish in the 16th century. They brought it over from Mexico because during their travels and imperial expeditions in Central America, they witnessed the harvesting of cochineal, which was used to make a red pigment, as you can see in these images. These are some cochineal beetles that are used. And they brought the cactus over to Europe in order to harvest this insect, essentially, because at the time there wasn't the means to produce such a long-lasting and vivid red pigment. So they saw it as a huge economic opportunity. So they brought the cactus to Europe along with some of the insect. But the insect didn't survive in the cold climates. The cactus, however, did and became a naturalized plant across the whole of the Mediterranean region, becoming an important source of food, both with the fruit as well as a cultural, political symbol. In Palestine, for example, it's been a very important hedge plant for centuries, used to demarcate villages and agricultural lands, as well as to provide food for the whole community. And one of the things that we were interested in as well when visiting Palestine and doing the work there was traveling to destroyed villages in the 1948 lands, which is now considered Israel. Because some of the only remnants that remain of a lot of these villages are the hedges which were planted to border the lands of each individual agricultural piece of land, because most of the buildings and architectural remnants were destroyed and planted over with trees. So one of the only symbols really that remains of a lot of these settlements are cactus hedges, which continue to grow in the place that they've always grown for centuries, because they're very hard to uproot. So in that sense, since 1948 especially, the cactus became a really important symbol of Palestinian resistance and resilience in the face of occupation. After the cactus became naturalized in Europe, it also spread to countries such as Australia and South Africa, where it grew largely out of control and swallowed up acres and acres of farmland. So in those countries, the cactus was seen as invasive and aggressive and a problem. So what they did was, in the last few decades, they introduced different species of insect to combat and kill, essentially, the cactus. One of these being the specific species of cochineal, which is now in Europe, which then spreads through Africa to Spain and the Mediterranean basin and is now responsible for the death of around 80% of cacti in Palestine. So now we're faced with the situation where this plant that a lot of Palestinians consider to be native, even though it was actually brought over a few hundred years ago, is now being destroyed by this insect, which is actually the principal reason that the cactus was initially brought to Europe to harvest. But they don't have the historical practice of using this insect at all in Palestine. So we're interested in examining this situation from an ecological perspective, colonial perspective, political perspective, but then also looking at the materials, the dead cactus, as well as the living cactus, and also this insect. Yeah.
So in the beginning of this year, we spent about 6 weeks, around 2 months in Palestine, and with an organization, Sakia, right outside of Ramallah in the West Bank, in a small village, farming village, Ain Kenya. And it was part of the Soil Futures Network, where they had networks in Palestine, in Italy, and the UK, where people could travel in between. And so when we were there at Sakia, our residency synced with a period at Hamasiniye, which is a farming calendar with a period of 50 days that precedes spring. And so people have observed different changes within this period, and they divide it into 4 sads. So each is equal to 12 and a half days. And so we decided to follow this timeline and sort of stay tuned to the changes occurring around us as we progress throughout the residency and our time in Palestine. And so according to Palestinian lore, it symbolized a journey of a man named Saad. And so if you go, so then Saad Thaba, meaning Saad the slaughterer, extends from the 1st until the 12th of February. And during this time, Saad traveled with his camel against the warning of his father about the weather. And so caught in heavy rain and cold, Saad resorted to slaughtering his camel and taking refuge in its belly for warmth. And this 12-and-a-half-day period is characterized by extreme cold, heavy rain, and sometimes even snow. And so just like Saad, we were caught up in heavy rains and cold, keeping us indoors. And so we used that time to really research and think more about our sort of residency period. And the few days that there was actual sun and warmth and for us to go outside were days that we did field work. So going to doing walks around the village, going to areas around Palestine to start looking and collecting the cactus fibers, a lot that you see on your tables here, as well as collecting the cochineal insects and starting to actually play and work with these materials.
The second Saad, Saad Asud, is a period where the flowers ripen and bloom and the trees begin to awaken from the winter sleep.
We're on Saad Bela.
We're on the Saad. Oh shit, yeah, sorry. Saad Bela, meaning Saad the swallower. During this period, the temperatures rise and the earth quickly absorbs the heavy rainfall of Saad Tabe, filling the springs and aquifers with water. So during this period, the sun came out and we were able to start working in the field, gathering materials, knowledge and stories for our residency, just as the earth was gathering the waters from the recent rains into its aquifers. So we started kind of taking more walks around the local areas, seeing how the cactus kind of interacted with other local vegetation. understanding its role within the contemporary, like, our agricultural landscape of the terraces in the hillsides nearby where we were staying. Looking at different artistic motifs that include the cacti in Palestinian painting. We traveled to the Jordan Valley to understand how different biomes and different ecosystems within Palestine, how it was being affected differently by the spread of the cochineal. At the time, we witnessed the largest amount of healthy cactus that we'd seen since arriving in Palestine in the Jordan Valley, and we started formulating ideas or theories around why this potentially could be the case. Some of them included the fact that it was much more dry. The cochineal insect prefers damp, dark areas. It normally grows on the underside of the cactus pads to be protected from wind and from the elements. So that was one potential theory. We held our first workshop in the village with locals from Ramallah as well as from Ain Kinya, where we walked around and explained a bit of the history of the cactus, how it arrived in Palestine, and started collecting materials such as the dried cactus, such as what you have on your tables, to begin to work with and play with, getting everyone involved, playing with the cochineal itself, which you can squash directly onto your hand, which produces this really vivid red pigment from the carminic acid. And playing around with looking at these materials through a microscopic lens. This is one of the cochineal beetles, one of the only ones that we found alive at the time, because it was kind of not a good season to find live insects. A lot of them had already died. These are some of the fibers of the cactus. We played around with soaking them to make them more pliable and malleable. Some people started blowing bubbles through them. Here you can see the color of the cochineal.
Yeah, and so then the third, Sad al-Sud. So during this period, the flowers ripen and bloom, the trees awaken from their winter sleep, and the signs of spring begin to appear. And so we started putting into practice the knowledge we gathered these past 4 weeks, hosting workshops, sharing meals, and experimenting with fibers. And so with our second workshop, we start to have more and more people come in, and we began each workshop with food as a way of breaking the ice, but also gathering and talking and sharing stories. Then we also were foraging, trying to understand the local environment and the plants that can be found around Sakia, and looking at the different properties. There was a lot of knowledge being shared about how some of these properties of these plants could possibly be used to try to get rid of the cochineal. And so people were always experimenting with different agents. And then we were also hosting spaces for people to just experiment. We came into this project not knowing a lot about the cactus, and it was something that we wanted to build knowledge with the community. We didn't want to go into the community saying that this is how you should do things, or we're the expert and we know. And so it was really important to us that we sort of shared our journey with them and brought them along with us, and so that we can, have a conversation and build together. And so So yeah, so then we started experimenting with weaving techniques, especially in Palestine and the region. There's a rich culture of weaving and embroidery. And so also thinking through pigments and how can we use this color within embroidery, within dye making. And so then trying to understand the properties of the dye, how do we create pigments and paints and processes through it.
And the fourth and last period of the winter, Khamsiniya, is Saad al-Khabaya. In this period, Saad, fearing that the storm would recur, made a coat from the hair of the camel and stored the remaining camel meat. During this time, animals such as reptiles and insects awaken from their hibernation, signaling the arrival of spring. Like Saad, to wrap up our residency and prepare for the future, both of the project as well as the practices that we'd been collectively growing throughout the residency, we explored ways in which we can leave a lasting impact on the communities and ecosystems that we were working with throughout the period, through dyeing, cooking, building, planting. The differences in the local ecology was quite interesting during this time. Like, it was really fast, the changes that you would see in the trees and the fruits. We'd been throughout the whole residency collecting cactus pads from all over Palestine, the different destroyed villages that we'd been visiting, Ramallah, Ain Kinya, different, every area that we'd gone to, we collected fresh cactus pads, especially from plants that we noticed were dealing very well with the spread of the cochineal, either had fought it off or seemed unscathed. Our hopes being that these plants perhaps carried some kind of resistance or resilience to the spread of the cochineal specifically. And our idea was to bring these back to Sakia and to plant them along the perimeter of the building, where, as you can see in the background, they have a temporary metal fence. But they were interested in building a living hedge to protect the site from settler raids. There's a nearby settlement, and they'd had problems in the past of settlers coming on site and destroying part of their infrastructure and stealing tools and livestock. So this was kind of a beginning of an exploration of how to construct a living hedge around the property to protect it. And something that we liked about the idea is that this hedge was not only a monument to all of the destroyed villages that still persisted through these cactus hedges, but that they would also help to protect future generations as well. This is a large sheet that we dyed previous to the workshop. And during the workshop, people experimented with different dyes to print patterns on this large sheet, to experiment with pattern making. Local kids were swimming in the pool. We continued the experimentation of weaving with the fibers, trying to begin the construction of like a shade roof for part of the area of Sakia. This was the beginning, which was like the middle. It's hard to see the pattern. But it's an incredible material because it's very lightweight, but also quite durable, and also has all of these holes, which really allows like air and sunlight through, as well as to be useful in the process of building.
Yeah, and one of the things that we learned when we were there, going back to, again, the Oslo Accords, was how the Accords separated the land into areas A, B, and C. And so area A is controlled by the Palestinian Authority, while B and C is controlled by Israel. And so Area C is an area where you're not allowed to build at all. And so Sakia is in Area C. And so they cannot build an extension to the organization, to their house. They can't add any sort of foundation. And so one of the things that we're working through is how do we use these cactus fibers to create a roof so that over time it degrades naturally, doesn't have this foundation. And so we're working around sort of these limitations and sort of this gray area. But then again, you still have settlements on either side of Sakia, and that is how Israel is justifying its building of settlements, is through these areas that it controls. And as well as the cactus hedge that we planted around the perimeter. Again, it's this idea of using the cactus as a means of fighting off these raids, but also as this like natural living organism that doesn't need this foundation, that can go around the politics and legalities that is politically made.
And it's interesting as well in terms of thinking through how plants are categorized, and especially the categorization of trees, because in Area C, also it's illegal for people to plant trees because that's seen as a way of claiming ownership of the land through planting and through harvesting what those trees produce on that land, whether they're olive trees or fig trees or plum trees or whatever kind of orchard tree, but that extends to all trees. So it's also interesting that cactus hedges, which are often can grow to the same height or if not bigger than a lot of trees in Palestine and can often be considered trees, are still not necessarily within that legal category.
Mm-hmm.
Should we move on to?
Yeah. So sort of taking these experiments and what we learned at Sakia, we are continuing to work with these different themes. And so with pigment, we're working to continue dyeing and creating dyeing processes with the cochineal. You want the next one? And sort of trying to create these different shades because it's a pigment that is so sensitive to pH. You add an acid to it and it becomes bright orange. You add an alkaline, it becomes a deep dark purple. And so you have this range of reds and pinks within that. So thinking through dyeing and then also thinking through ink making. So then using that dye to create a lake pigment, which you can then extract the solids, dry it out, grind it, and then turn it into an actual ink, which you can then use to create prints. And so throughout the journey, we were taking a lot of photographs, and then with these photographs, started to make lithographic prints with the etching ink from the cochineal. And so then bringing the ink, these lithographs with the images to create sort of these images, sort of these palimpsests that sort of, these ghostly images that sort of mimic the way that the cochineal starts to eat away at these cactus, so eating away at these images as well. And then another means of communicating the work is through publishing, through writing. And so in this piece, we're talking about the hedge that we planted around Sakia, the memorial created through the hedge, and hopefully its ability to protect in the future. And so you see here a map around the border of Sakia and the different villages in which we collected the pads. And then also continuing to write about the fading cacti, as well as the histories, the politics, the social conditions.
The future of the project is that we're curious to do similar field work in Central America as well, looking at more historical practices that use the insect as well as the cactus in different ways as building materials in dyeing, weaving, etc. We have plans to go to Mexico this year and continue working around the Mediterranean basin as well, and completing the work that we started in Sakya as well with the roof. I think the awareness of these seasonal shifts teaches us in a way to prepare for the inevitable change, to store, to seed, to preserve, to make the most of, to use sparingly. For us, I think seasonal practices were quite important in that way, especially for working around people and land and ecological practices, around how we want to use plants and land to cultivate ways of being that ultimately look towards the future as well as being rooted in the present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we see a lot of the work that we do is connected to the Palestinian struggle for freedom by countering these colonial and anthropocentric land practices, which we are continuing to do and hoping to continue to do in this work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ailo and Gabriella, for this strong and moving presentation of the Wild Hedges project. So we have, I think, 10 minutes for questions and comments from the room. And we will again walk around with microphones. While you think about which questions to ask, I might mention that we have set up the soiling table a little bit more since this morning, including with a range of soil pigments that are made by Kirsten Martinsen, who is used to be until 2 weeks ago a gardener and communicator here at Vitenparken, and is an ecologist but with a strong interest in soil painting. So if you would like to test your hand at some soil painting, I mean, you were talking about inks and the making of pigments, so it's also a good connection in towards the work that you have been doing. And you might imagine yourselves working with cochineal coloring as well. Yeah. Questions, comments? Marianne?
I don't come up with a smart question. I just want to say that I thought it was an absolutely amazing presentation, and it just stays in my head. And thank you so much for doing this work. And it seems like an extremely important work, and I think it models what we could do in many other places in the world that are less intense at the moment, but still. Thank you.
Thank you.
I suspect that the silence in the room is also a result of that strongness, and the fact that this is it's such a moving and emotional situation for many of us to talk about the context of Palestine at this point in time. Show me, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for a beautiful presentation and for the great work that you're doing. I just wanted to ask you about your thoughts on, and the work that you've been doing about the differences between settler relations to the land and ecologies versus the colonized people and their view of, I mean, there's a lot of care that goes into preserving these ecologies because there's a connection with the past. And in settler ecologies is also a connection with the past, but it's a terraforming project that wants to defile a certain landscape and to make it in an image of someone, some sort of an idea of what it is to be progressive, civilized, and this notion of civilized versus the colonized and the civilized, uncivilized. Can you just, reflect on what went in? Because these places are quite intense.
Yeah, I mean, I wish Areej was here because this has been her whole research project, where she was looking at the weaponization of trees by Israel and the Jewish National Fund, and how in 1948 they came in and started to terraform the land into an image of Europe, of bringing in pine trees from Europe that are not local to the environment, and using that as ways of sort of pushing people off their land, of covering up villages that have been destroyed, and really terraforming. I mean, this whole idea of making the desert bloom is a completely colonial settler mindset. And there have been people who've been living on these lands for generations who understand how to live with it and don't need to change it. And so there's a complete sort of difference in how Israel sees the land versus how Palestinians see the land. They've lived on it for generations and understand it and work with it, and
the legalities of land practices as well play into that a lot, hugely, like what Gabriella was mentioning through the Oslo Accords, when the lands in what is now the West Bank were divided into Area A, B, and C. Area C, which forms, I can't remember the exact percentage, but the large majority, if not most, of the areas of natural, so-called natural landscapes in the West Bank. It's illegal to forage certain plants, for example, like such as zatar, which is thyme, meramiya, which is sage, akub, which are all plants that are key to not only Palestinian culture, but Palestinian food and diet, and that have been foraged for centuries, millennia. And there's even evidence to suggest that foraging wild plants encourages them to grow, because the more you pick them, the more they grow new shoots, and it kind of helps to keep the health of the ecosystem intact. And so these arguments around preservation and conservation of natural beauty and natural habitats, this kind of natural park kind of discourse that Israel imposes on Palestinian lands is, I mean, very clearly one of control, but also arguably contributing to ecological decline as well as cultural violence.
Yeah, but what's also really beautiful about Areej's work is that she's been creating a counter-archive. So using walking as a methodology to start understanding sort of the space, the trees that she's interacting with, and then talking to locals about the names in Arabic for these trees, and then trying to understand the roots of these names. And because within those names, it tells you a lot about how to use these trees, how to use these plants, as well as the sort of the relationship with the plants. And so sort of countering these like scientific names, these names given by Israel, to then, create an archive that is rooted in the local.
It's a really beautiful and important work, indeed. Are there other questions or comments from the room? Davina, Elisa?
Thank you. That was a really, really wonderful and beautiful and moving presentation. I was just wondering, from your time that you spent in the West Bank and the communities that you met with, and knowing that many people don't have access to their land, they don't have access to their soil, or it's severely controlled through checkpoints and instability of knowing when you can cross that checkpoint and that road to get to your farm that day, or to get to your olive trees, or and a lot of people have just overnight lost their land, or how I'm interested in this relationship between kind of land and soil, and how do people's relationships with the soil, how do they talk about them, or what sort of ways do they yeah, I guess, yeah, I don't know how to put this, but yeah, how when they don't have access to their land, to their soil, what sort of conversations or ways of keeping that connection do you, yeah, have you heard of, or how do people, yeah, I'm just wondering, like, what do you do when you don't have access to your land and your soil, and how do you keep those memories and those archives going when you can't physically touch it or necessarily see it, or, yeah.
I was there in the summer previous as well, visiting Areej, and we were traveling, doing some research for her project, which I was assisting her with, and we visited the Deheisha refugee camp outside Bethlehem, which her mother is from, and she still has family who live there, and obviously the large majority of the people that live there are from depopulated and destroyed villages in 48 lands. And one of the ways that they have been trying to cultivate this kind of sense of home, of the lands that they came from, is by growing a lot of plants in like the small spaces that they have as gardens between buildings. There's like a huge abundance of trees and plants and orchards in these small spaces that are tended very, with a lot of care. And people talk about this as very much, like the closest that they can get to their lands, especially the trees, especially fruit trees. And we met with this man who runs a community center there, and he was showing us photographs from a trip that he went on a few years ago when he was granted permit to cross the checkpoint to find the village where his mother grew up and was from. And he went with his mother to try and find the village, and they were walking through this landscape, and his mother was saying all sorts of things like, oh, I think the well is like over there, or, oh yeah, the house was here, this is where this was, this is where that was, and he thought that she was kind of projecting, and like, how could she remember, and there's nothing here. He was like, Mum, there's like nothing here, like it's just grass. And she was like, no, walk like 10 meters that way and you'll find like the old well and blah, 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 blah. And yeah, it ended up being there as well. So, and for him, I think that trip meant a lot, but also how the trip was kind of encapsulated in the photographs was, yeah, really important. But yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a really tough situation to feel that displacement.
Yeah, but I find that with people who are displaced, it's always nature, it's always the land around them that they hold on to that ties them to the place. Because like my mother is from Lebanon, and so she had to leave during the war, but she still vividly remembers the orange trees around her apartment and smelling the orange blossoms and the forest behind, and the different fruits and plants that she would eat as a child. And those are always the memories that she goes back to and the stories that she tells. And so there's something that I think they sort of become the connection to soil and to land. It's these memories as well as these tangible materials, these tangible plants, beings that keep us connected to the land.
I think those are really beautiful final words. So thank you so much again, Ailo and Gabriella, and also Areej, who couldn't be here. So we will move directly on with the program, and just a big hand for all that.